welcome to this last session, I believe. So what we have is a very, very expansive subject, nothing less than the state of the world. And we have a wonderful set of speakers. What we don't have is time. We only have 45 minutes. So we're going to try and go through this. But we have our speakers who are all very good at this kind of thing. So we're going to have a rapid set of initial comments of 2 to 3 minutes. And then we will open up for a second round. And then we'll come to the audience for question and answers. I'm also aware that we're standing between you and the dinner, and drinks and dinner. So we'll try and close this exactly in 49 minutes. So let me say in the beginning, I think when we talk about this state of the world, at least 4 broad themes stand out. One, there is a great technological revolution that is unfolding, which is partly the theme of the Global Technology Summit. We have a crisis in the global trading order, and soon it will extend to the financial order as well. We have a churn in the great power relations. All the major powers are reworking their relationships, that is US, Russia, China, Europe. And then we have 3 major geographies historically, which is Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East. All 3 of them today have serious crisis. So I think there is much happening and a lot of uncertainty in terms of given the variable that the American domestic politics has become a principal variable in global politics. We don't know enough of Chinese domestic politics, given the rate at which defense ministers and generals disappear. I wouldn't presume that there's nothing happening in Chinese domestic politics. So I think the big churn in the domestic politics, and I think how that affects the global system is what we're going to try and focus. But before I go to the panelists, I just want to say one other thing. This is not just about geopolitics or geoeconomics. What is at stake today is really an attempt to restructure modern capitalism. That what's happening in the US is really the challenge to the existing order is about redefining relationship between capital and labor, between state and capital, and also between, while we talk about globalization, capital is still national. That the competing tensions between different capitals in American, Chinese, European, Russian, not much of it there, but this tension between these competing groups, how they deal with the technological change, how they deal with the territorial and other issues, those have become quite serious. So therefore, we're talking about a more fundamental, deep structural change in the international system. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start with Lisa Curtis. We'll talk about the US, then I'm going to go to Bonnie, who's going to talk about China. Then I'm going to go to Ambassador Varma, who's going to talk about Russia. And then I'll come to Thorsten, who's going to talk about Germany, and Hervé, who's going to talk about European Union. And then I have Gadam Dharmendra, who's going to talk about Middle East. So all of them are going to speak for 2-3 minutes, and then we'll take a second round of questions. So Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raja. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. And despite having worked in the first Trump administration, I would say, I'm still struggling to decipher in many ways the second Trump administration strategy. But let me try to break a few things down. I would say on the security side, we actually are starting to see the outlines of an Indo-Pacific strategy shaping up. We have seen good visits from the Japanese Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister. We saw Secretary of State Rubio hold a quad meeting literally on his first day on the job. And we saw a visit by the Defense Secretary to Japan and the Philippines, where he very much reiterated the U.S. commitment to those 2 important alliances. And we've seen reports about the interim guidance, the Defense Strategic Guidance, which of course is a classified document, but the Washington Post has reported on it. And it reportedly talks about the U.S. need to deter China and to defend Taiwan, and to do this by increasing the U.S. troop presence and posture in the region, improve logistics and pre-positioning of weapons and other stocks in the region. So, if you look at these data points, I think, you see a certain continuity in the Indo-Pacific strategy going from the first Trump administration through the Biden administration to now. However, I think some of these assumptions were turned on their head last week on the so-called Liberation Day, or the Day of Tariffs. And I say that because the tariffs, were across the board, even on our Indo-Pacific partners and allies, and it created tremendous confusion. And I think now, many of our allies and partners and countries across the world, may not see that there is a strategy in place, or they don't understand what it is. And they're probably worried that there may be more chaos and confusion on the horizon. I would also say that with regard to the Indo-Pacific, I think there are reverberations because of Trump's equivocation on support to Ukraine. And I think this will have an impact in the Indo-Pacific, in that it will make our partners and allies feel that we're less reliable, and it could encourage our adversaries because it makes America look weak. And I see a certain contradiction in the Trump philosophy of peace through strength and this apparent showing of weakness in the face of Russian military aggression. And I think that, unfortunately, the Vegas rule does not apply to strategic affairs, in that, what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe. And I don't think you can expect to try to, face down, or you can't show weakness in the face of military aggression in one region of the world and expect that that won't impact deterrence in another region. And I would just add that I think there are questions about how the U.S. changing relationships with its European allies, how that's going to impact the global order more broadly. And I think, what we're likely to see is countries turning more to the UK and to Europe when it comes to upholding that rules-based order. And that, the U.S. looks a little less reliable on this front, and that, this is going to impact sort of the overall balance, and the U.S. just won't be seen as a reliable partner.
Thanks, thanks, Lisa. Bonnie, it's your turn. Going to hear about China.
Well, thank you, Raja. And I want to pick up exactly where Lisa left off. I think that the actions of the Trump administration, not only the tariffs, but also the suspension of U.S. aid and many other actions that are being taken, are damaging U.S. credibility and weakening American soft power. And the full consequences, I think, have yet to be felt, but I'm watching closely how the Chinese are reacting to this. And I see a great deal of evidence that they are trying to seize opportunities. And we heard your minister's comment this morning, any country would seize opportunities. But the Chinese, I think, have actually been preparing for this for some time. Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, and I think realized then that he was going to enter a more chaotic world. He started to talk about changes unseen in a century, which entailed both opportunities and risks, but increasingly opportunities. And he very clearly sees the United States in inexorable decline. And what we are seeing since the Trump administration has come in, and particularly since Liberation Day, is the Chinese being very explicit, trying to tell countries that they are a better partner than the United States. So the Chinese top diplomat met with the Japanese and Korean counterparts and told them that close neighbors are better than relatives far away. Xi Jinping actually wrote a letter to your president and called for India to realize a dragon-elephant tango, right? So they've, of course, reached out to Europe as well. So this is really quite explicit. It is true, of course, China won't succeed everywhere. It will likely overstep. But we see efforts for China to expand markets for its goods, to extend its political influence, to try and shape the global order so that it is more favorable to Chinese interests. I think clearly that there will be, that China will have difficulties for several reasons. One is widespread concerns about China shock 2.0, wariness of Chinese dominance and influence, which is in many places, including, I think, in China's neighborhood. And China's economic challenges at home will limit the extent to which, of course, it can step in and give foreign assistance around the world. And the Chinese don't give foreign assistance in the same way that the United States and some other Western countries do. But the point that I'd like to make is that counting on China to misstep and to not be successful is a bad strategy. What we need to have is a strategy, I think, to provide effective alternate options to countries. And China is going to be focused particularly on the global south. And they will make headway in areas like Southeast Asia and in Africa. And so I think that other countries really need to step up, to put forward their own visions, even if it is not the United States that are putting forward the best vision, that countries like India in collaboration, and including, of course, Europe, and Japan, other countries in Asia, should be stepping up to, I think, make it more difficult for China to succeed in inserting its own norms, its own practices and standards in the international order going forward.
Thank you, Bonnie. Venkat? Yeah.
Thank you, Raja, and thanks to Rudra and Carnegie India for the invite. About Russia. At the end of December, Russia was completed the third year in the geopolitical doldrums on the equator. Since then, it has moved with the result of the most positive Western leads that it has had for many years. It has become the most successful swing state in global geopolitics today. And what is the evidence for that? The evidence for that is Mr. Stephen Witkoff's presence today in St. Petersburg. He's had meetings in the morning, and in the evening he'll be meeting President Putin. And when he completes his meeting, I guess if you add up the total face time that any Western country has had with President Putin, Mr. Witkoff, the special envoy of President Trump, will score the highest number of hours. Compare that with the, forget face time between leaders, compare that with the engagement between China and the United States of America under President Trump. The meter is near zero. If you want to see the current Trump tariff chart, Russia is at 0, China is at 145%. What is it that the United States and Russia can talk together? They are rediscovering that as big powers, they have tremendous leverage, provided there is a political will to align those issues. And what are those issues? Ukraine is one part of that conversation. As big powers and as global powers, they have much more to talk about. And what then is the Russian strategy? Russia today, after 3 years of war in Ukraine, is too weak to win, and Ukraine is too strong to lose. So the tipping factor is the driving force that the United States of America has had for decades on what is the nature of European security for ever since the end of the Cold War. That said, the Russian strategy is to engage with the United States on Ukraine, but to compensate for its weakness on the military field, to get a peace deal on the negotiating table that will also involve a new reset in Russian and American relations on global issues. Middle East, energy, possibly Iran, possibly American companies coming back into the equation, and arms control going forward, quite apart from housekeeping issues on re-establishing diplomatic links and things to that. If there is a peace deal on Ukraine, supported and sponsored by the United States of America and Russia, it will be welcomed the world over, except in Europe. Europe today is the biggest X factor in the Ukrainian settlement. Europe, we know today, is a recognized economic entity. Without the United States of America, whether Europe can be a strategic entity is a matter for the future. There is no evidence currently that Europe including those 29 countries which call themselves the like-minded countries who wish to step in. Of course, things can change. Germany can change its position. There can be a new coalition. There can be a build-up, a promise build-up. That said, I think Russia is in a strategic geopolitical sweet spot. May not last for very long, but relatively speaking, I think they are doing better than they have done in the past.
We're better to go from Russia than to Germany. So Germany historically had a more complex relationship with Russia. Was also the most transatlantic in recent decades. So how is Germany changing and how is Germany seeing?
Thank you, Raja. I think I'll leave it to the ambassador to respond to this because I think the world is not in a sweet spot. Maybe Russia in its fantasies is in a sweet spot, and maybe you think it's in a sweet spot. But let me, rather than talking about Germany, and this morning I talked about de-risking and all these things, we have a panel on the state of the world, and that actually pertains to the ability of the collective institutions and efforts that we all are responsible for to deliver to citizens on humanitarian assistance, on other issues. And I think there, I find it a little harder to see opportunity in this present moment, because you have a moment of destruction where the US is actually not burning its own treasure fleet of soft power, but it's also putting the sledgehammer to the international order it kind of underwrote, also financially, over the past 8 decades. And you can think about the role of the US and its egotism and its exemptionalism, that it never kind of adhered to the rules that it professed to, and so on. But at least it paid up to a degree, and it was an important part for this system of international institutions that provide action on climate, on humanitarian emergencies to work. And now, Lisa, you said, like, US is putting the sledgehammer to it, and let's see what's left of it. But it doesn't seem to be awfully much for now, but hopefully I'm wrong. And you said, like, countries are now turning to Europe and the UK, including Germany. I don't think we're in a particularly good position right now to deliver on that. During Trump 1, Germany started the Alliance for Multilateralism. We actually filled a number of the holes in the humanitarian system that the Trump reduction at the time. We're not in that position now. None of the countries is. Look, the UK just traded its own development assistance and so on for reinvestment into its military. We're cutting our budgets as well. It's not that we're not doing anything. I think we're still committed, but in terms of underwriting global institutions. But I think the collective effort we need to make, including with India, is to say, what do we want to preserve, and where do we want, because we cannot save everything, and so on. And in humanitarian assistance, for example, an area where we work a lot as an institute to say, we come together and make sure that the system doesn't totally go down the drain, or at least we use this present moment. That would be an opportunity to make it more locally owned, locally focused, and so on. But to think about it together with India, also some of India's friends in the Gulf and elsewhere, to actually make an effort. Because if we're concerned about the state of the world, I think our institute started working on global governance. Now I work a lot on deterrence, on de-risking, and all these issues that we need to face as Germany in a hostile and competitive world. But we shouldn't forget about the global institutions, and I think there at least we have not just an opportunity, but also a necessity to work together as Europeans and Indians to somehow at least make sure that this present attempt at destruction on the part of the US doesn't fully succeed.
Ambassador, yeah. Europe X Factor?
Oh gosh, I hope it's not a singing competition with the X Factor. And I also hope that the state of the audience is not as bad as the state of the world. And so I will try to keep it a little bit more on the high note. I mean, clearly, as you really mapped it out, Raja, I mean, how much the geopolitics is fueled, I would say, by a quadrant of factors. I will not talk about the X factor, but how the economics are being challenged with the different versions of capitalism, the mercantilist version, the state capitalism that we see from a larger geography east, and the traditional open liberal system in which we've been living. So that's the economy, and where we see competing visions and how they aggregate and how they are somehow creating asymmetries. The second, as I would say, is really how technology has moved from, I would say, the sphere of innovation and progress and used for economic and societal needs to something that is really clearly at the intersection of security and geopolitics. The societal choices also. That is really, it's at the end of the day, people are to be served, and they live in a world of anxieties and choices. And the last is, of course, the security environment, where we see new wars, new forms of wars. So you have these four quadrants, and clearly the way the four dimensions interact there is a lot of confusion and uncertainty that is generated by this. And I think that what comes out of this world, there are certain elements where I think provide pointers to what we can do with that. And this is certainly something of reflection for the EU. One is really about speed, the speed of changes. That is so much absorbing, we'll say, attention, even exhausting systems, because you cannot simply keep up. And I think one has to recognize that you can have the best agency possible, you will be somehow overtaken. So how you gear up your system and your agency to keep up with this dimension. The second is another T word, which is not tech, which is not the other one, tariff. It is trust. I've heard a lot about trust, and I think this is what I would call a critical raw material of geopolitics that is really now having a greater value than ever. And I think this is what is going to shape also the dynamics of the world, of the new world in which we are living. And Dr. Jashankar this morning referred to this aggregate of regional orders, of different geographies, and I think that's probably the way it will coalesce. And that bears a lot of implications for the EU. We are now engaged, and I beg to differ. I think the EU is past the time of being just an economic entity. I mean, I think one has also to revisit that. And I would take as a token of acknowledgement that Europe is so much talked about and becoming a focus of Russia, becoming a focus of the US, and even of China. That means that we are something, and something more than economics. The fact that EU is certainly going through a process, and I mentioned it the other day, of rearmament, economic rearmament, societal rearmament, military rearmament, is we are on the defense. We are certainly not in the best position now, but I think the pace of change and the transformational thinking in Europe and acting upon is tremendous. And our ability to remap our partnerships is also going faster with India, clearly. Where we were a few years ago, where we are now. But when we said, EU is only consumed into one single issue, which is Ukraine, wrong. Look at just where President von der Leyen was. She cracked the deal on Mercosur. She was in CARIFORUM, and she was in Central Asia. Now she has been here in India. We continue to engage on multilateral. But, and this is the key point that Thorsten made, we are not abandoning the global issues, the global challenges. Who is going to serve these global challenges and global commons? This is something that there's a lot of expectations that are generated, a lot of grievances. And here I think EU and India are very well placed to work together, to draw these bridges with the global south, to help deliver, to make the links with the expectations of the so-called global south, the developing countries, and address. And I think this is really an element where I think that is, we should not look only through the prism of the competition. Who is going to deliver the global good and the global commons? And I really think that EU and India can do a lot together.
Thank you. Madam, last but not the least, Middle East, which is very volatile.
Thank you, Raja. I think, Middle East appears to be much simpler than the conversations which preceded me, although it's a very complex landscape. And if I can borrow Lisa's talking points, what happens in the Middle East will not stay in the Middle East. And like you pointed out, the three geographies are linked. we see a fairly unsettled, volatile situation in the Middle East, which can have implications for East Asia. We have force deployments. The US has sent 2 carrier strike forces, built up its military assets, air assets in Diego Garcia. It's been attacking the Ansar Allah in Yemen. They have blocked shipping across the Bab al-Mandab, Red Sea, Suez Canal. They've disrupted shipping. So we have multiple cascading effects which are coming out of the Middle East. So what is the common factor linking them? And somewhere the Islamic Republic's name keeps coming up often, whether it's Iran, whether it's supply of drones and missiles for Russia in Ukraine, support for its so-called axis of resistance, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Hamas in Gaza, and Ansar Allah Houthis in Yemen. There's a common linkage between all of them, and therefore a resolution of the Iran issue, whether it's nuclear, missiles, support for its proxies, is going to be fundamental for stability in the region to the extent possible. It's not that Iran is going to hold a resolution of the Iran issue will hold the key. But I think the proposed talks between Iran and the United States, which will be starting tomorrow in Muscat, will be interesting. It will be useful to see where and how these so-called indirect talks will take place. A couple of fortuitous developments preceding this. One, the decimation of the axis of resistance in Lebanon, which has led to the weakening of Hezbollah and rise of back the political process in Lebanon with the appointment of President Joey Aoun. Ditto in Syria with the fall of Assad. We have a whole different landscape in Syria, which will cut off Iran's land connection, the kind of axis, the Shiite axis it had into Lebanon, and therefore it was also supplying Hamas. So we see a whole strategic change. So that's one fortuitous development. The other is, within Iran, there is, Raja, as you pointed out, the domestic, all politics is local. Within Iran, there are some interesting developments taking place. And this came out through a very unfortunate event, the demise of former President, late President Raisi in a helicopter crash last May. That led to a realignment within Iranian politics where we've seen the hardliners being marginalized or at least being moderated a little bit, and the reformists have come up. So we have the old Rouhani boys who negotiated the nuclear deal with the Americans and what we saw, the JCPOA, back in fray. And Abbas Araghchi is now the foreign minister. He'll be in Muscat tomorrow. So we have a great opportunity. I think Trump has to keep the focus away from threats, kinetic actions. The Iranians don't like it, and they'll double down. Whatever you can put as many sanctions as you want, you can issue as many threats. It's a big country. You can't just bomb them out of existence. You can't take out their nuclear facility. So we'll have to deal with that reality. So turn to first principles, deal with the nuclear issue, as Araghchi proposed long ago, soon after his swearing in. We can use the JCPOA as a framework, and there has been a change of facts on the ground. If we factor in all these things, a deal is possible. So tomorrow, we'll see how it goes forward. It'll be critical for the region because it's important for energy, global energy supplies. It'll be important for how Syria stabilizes, how Lebanon stabilizes, how Gaza stabilizes. I think a ceasefire in Gaza, much wanted, release of the hostages, everyone wants that. I think going forward, Iran somewhere holds the key in all these developments.
Thank you. I think I see that our speakers have been wonderful. They've been very disciplined. The clock has not been. The clock has been jumping time. Obviously, it's in a rush for drinks and dinner, but I think we got at least another few minutes. So I'm going to do one more round, very short, rapid fire, if you will. I want to ask each one of you that from what you said, given the churn and the breakdown of the existing multilateral institutions, what might be the one interesting institution you think will endure or will emerge out of the current crisis? Venkat, to you, that a Russia-America rapprochement, where would that lead Russia? Russia has been leading one type of organizations, right? BRICS, SEO. But do you see any Russia-US working together for a new type of architecture in some part?
Yes.
Briefly, just.
Raja, let me go back to your original question, the reforms, restructuring of global capitalism. I think you're spot on, which is the United States is a recalibrating power today, both domestically and its external commitments. In this recalibration, I think there's a very strong sense of relating means and capabilities and objectives. And in that, Russia sees a space in the Trump administration's global policy. And the global policy is that the United States wants to cut its losses, reduce its costs of maintaining European security. It has other commitments on global security in which I think the Russians see an opportunity. Having said that, they also see an opportunity to go back to the sinews of big power cooperation, Security Council cooperation, because at any deal that will come out on Ukraine will finally be endorsed by the Security Council. Whether France and UK will abstain, let's see. They want arms control to come back onto the deal. Damu spoke about the situation in the Middle East. JCPOA can come back on track, provided the Russians play ball with the United States, and the indications are they will. Look at the offside. Russia has very little international dependence on global capitalism. Inversely, that is a strength today because of the churn. China, which has benefited from global capitalism, is at the peak of its vulnerability. So these are two things that are taking place. Europe, we are seeing the birth of multipolarity, but in the case of Europe, it is Caesarean multipolarity. No party really wanted it. It's the circumstances which are now pushing Europe to choose between trading with China and taking on the tariff pressure from the United States of America.
Thanks, Venkat. I think, Lisa, one of the innovations of the American institutionalism has been minilateralism, Quad, AUKUS. You had a whole range of institutions that were created. Do you think they will endure? I mean, in a broader plurilateral, like-minded coalitions, is that the way US is going to go?
I'm pretty confident that the Quad is going to move forward. Not even just because Secretary Rubio held a foreign ministers Quad meeting on his first day, but because the Quad was revived after a 10-year hiatus during the first Trump administration. And of course, it was taken to new levels during the Biden administration, 4 in-person summits, multiple working groups established. I think there probably will be an interest in paring down and focusing more on issues like maritime security, critical minerals, technology, supply chains. But I do think, I talked about in the first round of remarks that countries will turn toward Europe, but I do think that the Quad could also become a grouping that countries will look toward. They'll see alternatives, so long as the Quad, continues to move forward and offer public goods to the region. So I do have optimism when I think about, the current global order starting to break down. I have a good dash of optimism that the Quad, at least on some issues, may be able to step in. The subsea cable issue, for instance. The threat to subsea cables is impacting, of course, Europe. The Nordic countries are dealing with this, what's happening in the Baltic Sea, a lot of subsea cables being sabotaged, but it's also happening in the Taiwan Strait, and China has been sabotaging subsea cables there. So this is an area where the Quad can step in, come up with solutions, come up with norms, come up with ways to levy consequences on countries when they're found to be involved in this kind of thing. So I do have a measure of hope in the Quad.
Madam, in Middle East has struggled with regionalism, right? It never had much of an institutions, though OIC, Arab League, none of them have succeeded. But recently there's been talk about Saudi-Iran normalization. Is there a way actually the region can come together in any form, or that's an illusion we should not entertain?
I think the latter would be more fair description. The Iran-Saudi rapprochement is still kam se kam sa, because they are also competing for space in Syria. If If you remember, President Al-Shara, interim President Al-Shara, first visit was to Saudi Arabia for funding for his Syria's reconstruction. Erdogan is playing for space in Syria. So how do you reconcile? GCC, the two top countries, Saudi and UAE, determine how GCC works. But just to take the discussion back to where you started about institutions, I would look at OPEC. I think if Iranian oil comes back into the market, which the Saudis don't want, continued sanctions on Iran is of benefit to the Saudis. There was some chatter in the past, even Russians didn't want Iranian oil to come back because that will bring prices down. It's going to be of immense benefit to Europe.
And to India.
Yeah, I mean, if you bring Iranian oil and gas back into the market, remember, 2019, till April 2019, the United States had given special exemption waivers for a couple of countries, which included Italy and Greece in Europe, because they were the landing areas for Iranian oil and gas, and India. We were about 3 or 4 countries which were giving those exemption waivers. Were JCPOA version 2 to come up, for which sanctions have to be lifted, and were Iranian oil and gas to come back into the market, we will be benefiting immensely given our presence in Chabahar. And if Iran shared the oil gas lines come there and we use Chabahar economic zone. So OPEC, I think institutions, OPEC plus, those will be interesting dynamics to watch out for.
You know, Germany has been a major champion of multilateralism, Alliance for Multilateralism. We saw a lot of new initiatives. So tell me, what do you see, I mean, not just from German perspective, but how in Europe or globally, what role Germany is going to play in rebuilding institutions?
I think, first of all, I think in Europe you have a second guessing of some multilateral arrangements. Look at the Baltic states, Poland and Finland pulling out of the landmines treaty because it wasn't stress tested for Russian aggression, and they said, like, we cannot afford to. We're rethinking our commitments on refugees in a major way. I mean, not that we're honoring them in practice to begin with on our borders, but there's also more formal ways that states step away from that. We're also rethinking the WTO because you have an enemy of free market economies at its midst, and we didn't kind of plan for that when China was admitted. So I think, at least in France and parts of Brussels, the new mantra is within the WTO as far as we can, but beyond the WTO if we must, to defend our interests. So Europe is no longer just wedded to the status quo because we're, you know, wherever we're dealing with direct threats to our interests, and forget about the International Criminal Court and our obsession with, you know, in Germany with or like our position on that that is quite hypocritical. So I think where we're going, and you asked, you know, what arrangements, I think it's a lot of new coalitions of the willing, and you know, within Europe you see that because we want to avoid the veto players. I think we'll see some sort of nuclear planning group for a plan B on nuclear deterrence in Europe at some point, because we need to plan for the US also pulling out from that. And also on tech development, I think there will be interesting arrangements, hopefully also on digital public infrastructure together with India, and three-way kind of partnerships, flexible ones, and I think some actually offer opportunities.
Hervé, NATO without America, or EU as a military force?
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to have a European army anytime soon. But I think to answer your question, I think, I mean, one or two examples of effective minilateralism is, I mean, you could take the EU itself and NATO. That is really structuring our continent. And I think there have been some misgivings and some doubts as to whether this will have enough strength and resolve, but as Galileo would say, eppur si muove, and still it turns around and it works. So I think this is, the first thing we have to do, and this is clearly, I would say, at the center of attention, is to consolidate this minilateralism. And I think, in a way, it has been in accelerated mode through shocks and pushes, but the idea of a stronger European pillar of the security order is very much now the point. I mean, if you look at the 800 billion rearm readiness 2030, I mean, what it is if it's not that. The second element for Europeans, I think, is in this agility in engaging with key partners. And I think when you look at the networks of FTAs and agreements we have, is second to none. I mean, we've just signing FTAs after the others, and others coming is because they see Europe as an interesting and certainly attractive partner. EU at the same time is really keen to engage with coalition of willings, as you said. I think aggregating around functional cooperation. And I think with India, we've done a few on the CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructures, on the International Solar Alliance, and we could do many more on the ICs and space governance, AI governance. I think these are areas where really we need to structure, and I think we need to work together. And the third one, which is probably the most difficult, which is the multilateral system. And I understand that there are grievances in terms both on its effectiveness and representation, and there is a hard work ahead of us, ahead of the UN Secretary General. How are we going to reshape that? And it's so easy to tear it up and said, well, you know, it's unreformable, and therefore we have to undermine it or do. I really think that we need to take it with resolve, and I think the EU will be there. I think clearly there are issues to be addressed, but if it's too easy to let the forces that will work against prevail, and I think EU would certainly look for partners around the world and how can we restore this multilateral system, because at the core of it, if you ask me, what is the nuclear reactor is the UN Charter. You take this out, it's a mess in this world, and not a world I would like my daughters to live in.
Bonnie, you've been talking about China building a new order. What might it look like? Very briefly.
Well, I think that China's been experimenting with order building for some time, beginning with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and with BRICS. And we've seen BRICS begin to expand. 4 countries join. There are more countries that are interested in joining. And I think that this is an experiment that China wants to continue. Of course, with more countries joining, it may be difficult to get much accomplished. I'm skeptical in the effectiveness of BRICS, but I do think that it is an important organization for China. Another organization that is important for China, but they have not yet joined, is CPTPP. And they're very keen right now to join that. And so I think that again, will become more important. Maybe we will see, we won't see the United States join, but maybe we will see other countries. I want to agree with Thorsten that I think the World Trade Organization is really, it is no longer fit for purpose. I think there are discussions already in Washington about what we do about that. Can it be updated? Do we get together with like-minded countries and find ways to fix it? Or, as Thorsten said, do we go beyond? Do we actually build something new? And I don't know if that is a discussion that will be had with the Trump administration and our other partners, but I think there's growing recognition that the World Trade Organization is no longer serving the purpose for which it was created.
Wonderful. I think, Rudra, with your permission, I'm going to scrap the audience. I know many people have been sitting here since the morning. So you saw our speakers actually raised very, very interesting issues, whether how Russia and US can do things. We talked about new many-lateral institutions. Gaddam talked about OPEC and how that could change energy politics. We had Benner talk about coalitions of the willing. We had Hervé talk about the new forms of multilateralism that Europe can lead, and Bonnie has talked about China and regional order. So I think we're really in an extraordinarily interesting moment. There is great disorder under the heavens, as has been said by Mao Zedong, but it also creates conditions under which actually new things could happen. In fact, if you recall, the disorder was deliberately created by Mao Zedong, the Cultural Revolution, which actually he forced a structural change, for good or bad, in the Chinese political order. I suspect Trump is doing something similar. But I think in this chaos, I think all of us will also have a lot to do in terms of shaping it. It's not just going to be one country that's going to decide. So I think there's a lot of room for collaboration, for engagement, to think through what comes after the current churn. And I think that is the exciting thing. And my sense is many of those issues, I think you can talk to our panelists over a glass of water or juice, whatever it is, and we can take the conversation further down there. So I would say please join me at this point, really for doing this marquee panel at the end of the day and making it so stimulating and so consequential in terms of how we think about the world. So.